Thank you. Thank you for assembling, and you understand with the multiplicity of speakers that we've got and technology to use that timing is particularly critical. My name is Daryl Moran. I'm a member of the MHHV committee, and it's my great pleasure to again welcome you here. Please don't forget there are books on sale up the back. A number of the authors are present here, or we're only too pleased to inscribe the 10 books that you're buying for your grandchildren to take home and treasure lovingly, I'm sure. My grandchildren haven't taken that option yet, but I'm yet to finish drafting my will. Our next session is dealing with the post-war chill. And we have 3 speakers, 2 of whom are in the room, and who has Mike Waltman, for example, I'll introduce a little later, has literally just flown in from Adelaide, flight delayed, and we've given a special warm welcome to Michael for being here today. We'll hear a little bit more from him later, once the whiskey kicks in. So we have 2 speakers of shorter duration, and then we have one who we're going to bring in online from Adelaide. We're going to run a panel session with the 3 speakers and also Peter Edwards. We'll do that in the last 20 minutes of the session. So you might want to think about framing your questions. Notice on the program it says Q and A, and that Q stands for questions. Notice it's not S and A, which stands for statement. So we really prefer the Q. I'm sure the speakers will be delighted to talk to you during the lunch break. Down to business. Our first speaker after morning tea is Professor David Lowe. He holds a chair in contemporary history at Deakin University and is the director of the Centre for Contemporary Studies at that institution. Biographer, historian of modern international affairs, especially with reference to Australia and its role in Asia and Pacific. He's a co-founder of the Australian Policy and History Network, and he's also served as a board member of the Australian Historical Studies Journal, and as a member of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Editorial Advisory Board, advising the Australian Foreign Minister, and we've heard that's gone extremely well so far in Australian history, as Peter Edwards alluded to a little later on, clearly doing a lot better as far as David is concerned. So he has, again, books and publications. His particular topic in his 35-minute address today is revisiting Menzies' national security state. I remind you, we will not be taking questions immediately after his address. We'll save the questions for the panel a little later on. Without further ado, Professor David Lowe.
Thanks very much, Daryl, and also Andrew and the Military History and Heritage Victoria group for enabling me to join what's such an interesting and stimulating program. I'm also very pleased to see the presence of National Archives Australia in their sponsorship. Terrific to have them here. They've certainly been absolutely fundamental to the work that I've done during the course of my career. And if I can just start perhaps with one National Archives story, which certainly relates to the Cold War, and that is, I don't know whether this is apocryphal or not, others may have heard this story, but it's one of my favourites, and that is around the journalist and author on matters to do with Australia's national security, Brian Toohey. Some people here may know of Brian's work. Brian has always been very assiduous at insisting that he has access to ASIO files as soon as they become available. And there was one file, he saw a packing list held in National Archives Australia, which was headed Whitlam government downfall, CIA's involvement in. He thought, clearly he'd struck gold. He requested this file be made available. It took some time, I think it took about 3 years. And then one day he got notification that this file was ready for him to come and look at. So he rushed in with much anticipation and was handed a very slim folder which he eagerly opened back at his desk in the archives. And in the folder contained, there was just one thing only. It was a cutting from a newspaper, a speculative piece by the then Herald Sun on the possible involvement of the CIA involvement in Whitlam's downfall, written by Brian Toohey. These things have a habit of coming around. So that was a form of revisiting, and revisiting is in my title. I'm revisiting Menzies' national security state in an attempt to enlarge our conceptualisation of Australia's security, what it means to be secure, and what preparing for war and preparing for the circumstances of the Cold War actually meant on the ground in terms of what was going on in Canberra when thinking about security. I'm revisiting also because some of the essential characteristics have been sketched from complementary angles by people such as Bob O'Neill, Alan Martin, Philip Deary, David Lee, Les Lewis, Peter Edwards, David Horner, myself, and others. I think it's timely revisiting also because we now know more about the unusual coincidences of the early 1950s that can sometimes mislead and continue to mislead interpretations of Australia's primary motives, the primary motives behind the Menzies government's defence and foreign policies. And I'll outline some of these in brief. But I also want to revisit the period with a view to highlighting two other prominent themes. The first is the overarching importance of national development for security. National development for Menzies and his colleagues was vital as they wrestled with the implications of the Cold War, something which I and others have, as I mentioned, have written about, but perhaps not developed fully enough. And the other theme related to this is the ongoing task of nation making, of figuring out ways to ensure that the Federation of Australia worked and that the Commonwealth would prevail over states in situations deemed necessary. So in my talk, I'm suggesting that in addition to some extraordinary international circumstances impacting on strategic thinking and policy in the early 1950s, Menzies' fears for an Australian national security state took shape very much in relation to the long-established mission of national development. Yep, it's just a fickle. Clicker? All right, I'm getting there. I'll get to learn the clicker. The three themes are on the board. Menzies' ideas, I'm suggesting, for an Australian national security state took shape very much in relation to this long-established mission of national development, of peopling Australia and effectively harnessing its resources, and especially in relation to the ongoing quest to make the Commonwealth of Australia workable, not in danger of splintering under testing conditions. I'm suggesting that this powers centralising federation management aspect of foreign and defence policies that we sometimes underestimate in our analyses. And it's this feature that comes to the fore in Menzies' attempts to build something of a national security state in the early 1950s, at a climax in Cold War alarms. But by way of an introduction to how these themes overlap, let me invoke the historian's privilege of reaching back in time a little. In 1936, Australia's Chief of General Staff, Major General John Dudley Laverack, laid out the groundwork for a military security intelligence to be in the driving seat of an expansive notion of what he called at the time Australia's national security. Born in Brisbane, Laverack had joined Australia's permanent military forces in 1905 in the artillery and worked in the War Office in London in the early part of the First World War, before joining up with Australian forces in France in July 16 and taking part in some of the key campaigns on the Western Front, while rising to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Upon returning home, he was Director of Military Training in the Army, and in 1927-28 completed a training course at Imperial Defence College in London. So he was very well credentialed. Classic kind of training. In 1935, he was appointed Chief of General Staff of Australia's Army. In his new position of authority, he became more vocal in some of the arguments he was having with some of the Australian defence chiefs. Essentially, Laverack felt that his colleagues were overly focused on a defence of Australia that turned on the ways in which Britain's Royal Navy might assist. Anticipating the tactics of some who came after him, and this is where I'll see if I can get this to work again. Yep. Laverack's strategy was to go high and wide in his description of the problem at hand. He titled his 1936 paper for the Defence Department and then Cabinet, National Security, the intelligence aspect, and he pointed to the Commonwealth Government's responsibility prescribed in Australia's Constitution to protect all aspects of Australian life, internally and externally. He continued, on screen, this of course is in conformity with the aim of every civilised community to maintain for its citizens the undisturbed and permanent enjoyment of independent nationality, individual freedom and collective wealth. This wealth consists of many aspects, concrete and abstract, such as material prosperity, moral prestige, powers of resistance against aggression. So long as any of these assets are liable to capture, destruction, injury or depreciation at the hands of the enemy, the state must provide their security. There followed a typology of the different types of intelligence needed: political, defence, public, economic. Laverack singled out the public aspect of intelligence, going to civic welfare and prevention of public violence, treason and sabotage as the most in need of attention for two main reasons. First, the current organisation, the Commonwealth Investigation Branch, was too small, too overstretched and too lacking in respect to coordinate effectively across other departments in order to meet the multiple needs of public intelligence. Secondly, Australia, unlike comparable governments such as New Zealand and Canada, had no federal police force with genuinely national jurisdiction. The Australian states all had police forces of separate sovereignty, for whom this kind of public intelligence work was low down their priority list. He concluded with a call for the urgent addressing of these two deficiencies. So this brief sketch is what seems to me to be an intelligence-led harnessing of a capacious rendering of national security. In other words, the point I'm making is, even though the nomenclature really kicks in a big way in the 1950s, it was very much there from the late 1930s. It was a capacious rendering of national security in Australia's terminology for war preparations at that time. It wasn't that the year 1938 was a watershed. The phrase national security appeared frequently when politicians were reporting on defence preparations during this period. But Laverack struck a nerve in highlighting the defence gaps revealed by Australia's imperfect federalism, a good measure of what he argued found its way into Australia's National Security Act of 1940, also on the screen. One of the biggest governance issues for Australia during that period, the 1930s, was a constitutional one, less dependent on law than on behaviour: the operation of the Federation of 6 states and 2 territories in relation to the Commonwealth Government in Canberra. And I could outline these, but I'll have to skip fairly briefly. Of course, the decade began with an imperial conference that produced the Statute of Westminster, formalising for all British dominions, including Australia, the right to conclude foreign treaties, enact laws against British law, and not be bound by lots of British legislation. Some of the dominions, though, as we'll recall, were much keener than others on having their independence formally enacted, and Australia was in the much less keen camp. The government of 1930 held out, joining New Zealand and Newfoundland on requiring parliamentary approval for the statute to become applicable. So when it did come into force at the end of 1931, its status in Australia was murky, and the Australian states were easily stirred into unnecessarily sometimes protestations that somehow their relationships with the British government had been compromised. What was at stake wasn't so much trade or security, it was mostly the chance to maintain high political ground in the stakes of imperial loyalty, and a sense that it may help in future politicking with the government in Canberra. The old Colonial Laws Validity Act of 1865 was somehow still valuable in the period, enabling them rhetorical positioning. So what today seems like a very strange pull from the past on Australian politics was reanimated throughout the 1930s by the fractious state of federal-state politics. And when finally the Parliament approved the Statute of Westminster more formally, it did so in order to confer powers for the government in 1942. It wasn't accompanied by any symbolic flourishes or proclamations of independence. In fact, the Adoption Act was called an Act to remove doubts about the validity of certain Commonwealth legislation, to obviate delays in its passage, and to effect certain related purposes. That Commonwealth legislation referred to was the National Security Act, where the government wanted to be absolutely certain of its authority to take control over key aspects of security and resource management. So fast forward now to 1950 and to a Prime Minister, and also a constitutional lawyer by training, Menzies. who had been very engaged with some of these events of the 1930s, and who in the 1950s was very inclined to interpret world conditions with the aid of memories, templating the experience of the Second World War, how Australia's geostrategic situation sat in managed tension with Australia's defence role as a member of the British Commonwealth, prepared to provide expeditionary forces to parts of the world deemed by leaders in London and Washington essential to the West defence, how assaults on European authority in Southeast Asia and technological advances, especially our air power, made the Australian continent potentially more vulnerable than before, how the dispatch of Australian forces overseas and provisioning of US forces within Australia affirmed Australia's identity as a white dominion within the Commonwealth and valued partner of the US, but it didn't, alas, open doors to the highest levels of strategy formation, and how it took a combination of government interventions and co-opted business leadership to provide the manpower and other resources for war while ensuring that the civilian economy didn't fracture. So in arguing the importance of the Second World War, I need to note that Menzies, of course, was only at the helm of wartime preparations up to August 1941, soon after which the Labor government of John Curtin came in. As is well known, Curtin secured more powers for the Commonwealth government, including income taxation, in order to prosecute the war effort. After the war, the Chifley Labor government continued to gain control, or at least attempt to gain control, over more levers of Australian economic and social conditions. At the same time, Menzies led a new Liberal Party back into political contention, very largely by harnessing resistance to Labor's controls and efforts towards greater centralisation of powers. In Power himself from December 1949, one of the tensions Menzies managed constantly was his disposition to seize more controls over essential parts of the economy while maintaining the high ground in support of private enterprise, enabling thrifty, enterprising Australians to grow their wealth unfettered by regulation. He also had to manage preparing for war. Like many others of his generation attuned to world war as a feature of the 20th century, Menzies genuinely feared the likelihood of another world war and was confirmed in these fears by visits to Berlin in 1948 and to London and Washington after that, where high-level strategic reports told of possible Soviet attacks. He wanted to ready Australia to play a strategically agreed role upon the outbreak of war with the Soviet Union, which British defence chiefs advised would be fought mainly in Europe and the Middle East again, as Peter's mentioned. According to both British and Australian defence chiefs, this role was providing air cover and an expeditionary force defending air bases in the Middle East, from which attacks could be launched on the Soviet Union. At the same time, Menzies and his colleagues were acutely conscious of the Japanese successes in the Second World War and the dangers of unravelling European authority in Southeast Asia. Indonesia's ambitions for Dutch or West New Guinea being a constant back-of-mind consideration that could quickly come to front of mind. From the middle of 1950, there were some extraordinary complications. At the end of May, the government agreed to a British request to send RAAF Dakota transports and Lincoln bombers to assist in the Malay emergency. In Parliament, Menzies said the situation in Malaya needed to be understood in the context of the global pattern of imperialist communist oppression. On 21 June, the Australian Council of Defence confirmed plans to send Australian forces either to Malaya or the Middle East upon the outbreak of war. 4 days later, North Korean forces invaded the south, prompting a UN Security Council resolution on 27 June calling on UN members to help South Korea. Having initially decided against sending Australian troops to Korea, Menzies found himself adjusting to offer to do just that. The Australian offer was prompted by External Affairs Minister Percy Spender, who got wind of a British offer of troops about to be announced, and with Acting Prime Minister Fadden quickly ventured an Australian offer before news broke of the British decision, thereby guaranteeing banking goodwill in Washington, all while Menzies was incommunicado on the high seas. Menzies likened the Korean War to the Spanish Civil War as the curtain raiser to the main event, which would again most likely be World War centred initially on Europe. It was both confirming of his thinking about the need to prepare for a European-based war and frustrating for his preparations. He launched a new defence program in August featuring national service. RAAF, national servicemen in the middle, and Menzies in consultation with Percy Spender and Fadden in the other photo there. So that national service was of 176 days for 18-year-olds. And it was accompanied by an ambitious stockpiling program. But those he hoped might anchor the training efforts, the dwindling numbers of army members in Japan, were suddenly now destined for Korea. Menzies' targets to increase both permanent and citizen forces at the same time were therefore doubly ambitious, as Bob O'Neill noted, exceeding in scope the special recruiting drive of 1938-39. His 3 radio broadcasts constituting his defence call to the nation in September 1950 depicted communists as responsible for everything, ranging from military spot fires around the world for the democracies to have to manage, for rising costs and anxiety at home also. The threat of atomic war, he said, was real, and the Soviets had enough bombs. And logically radicalised how Australian citizens should be thinking about their readiness. Now, as is well known, in December 1951, in the wake of the ANZUS Treaty being signed off, which was described by many as a bolting of Australia's back door, the back door being the Pacific. And at that time, in December 51, we'd seen also a deterioration of Britain's position in Iraq and restlessness in Egypt. The Australian government actually did agree to the first dispatch of an expeditionary force to the Middle East upon the outbreak of war, but then delayed communicating this to London and later reverted to the option of sending them first to Malaya or the Middle East. Major reason for the delay was the scrambling by services to arrive at what Cabinet wanted, an army division available 6 months after the outbreak of war, and 3 1/3 by 9 months. 5 squadrons of aircraft from a plan of a total of 9 by 3 months. Also by May 1952, changing circumstances in the Middle East and greater concern for the French position in Indochina meant that the British began to revise their thinking about how Australia could best assist in the Cold War. And the Australian Cabinet decision, never communicated to London, was quietly shelved. It required a big shift in the ways in which the Australians adjusted to thinking more seriously about change in Southeast Asia in order to come to terms with the French developments there. But I've also stressed the theme of national development. As Menzies geared up for war in December 1950, he created a National Security Resources Board, modelled loosely on the American body, set up in 1947, to advise on how to keep the civil and military economies in some type of balance. He explained the rationale for the NSRB in terms of his need for advice on how to superimpose an expansion of the immediate and prospective defence programs on an economy already bearing the strain of ambitious programs of development and immigration. In connecting the tasks of defence preparations and development, then and in subsequent comments, Menzies spoke of complementarity and integration of efforts. In many ways, these were continued efforts started by Ben Chifley for rapid reconstruction, including rebuilt and expanded power generation, new transport and housing, and renewed manufacturing efforts, all while ramping up immigration. As well as his NSRB, there was a new Ministry for National Development under Richard Casey. Now, I can't do full justice to the work of the NSRB here, but let me offer an illustration of the broad remit it had. In March 1954, as it was just about to wind up, it published a 63-page booklet called Defence and Development. You have on screen the contents page of this booklet, which I think were instructive when you look at that list. In brief, what stands out is the comprehensiveness of the survey of Australian economic activity and the flat, non-prioritised way in which these component parts are presented. Reading through the booklet, it seems that the destruction of rabbits through myxomatosis was an achievement of seemingly comparable weight to the introduction of the National Service Scheme. Addressing shortfalls in power supply in New South Wales and Victoria was soon followed by discussion of inadequate capacity and speed in shipping freight and railway rolling stock, and so on. The NSRB, and by extension the government, devoted special attention to food production and power generation on the basis that they were both crucial to Australia's rapid development and its capacity to play envisaged roles upon the outbreak of war. The Australians confirmed with British authorities during 51-52 that Australia was also expected to be a main support area in time of war. In other words, a supplier of food, especially grain and wool for Commonwealth forces. Then the Americans jumped in. They added an expectation of feeding perhaps up to 1 million US servicemen who could potentially be deployed to the Pacific. It was frustrating to be told by allies how to prioritise without having any real input into the process. Neither ANZUS nor the earlier preparedness to commit to the Middle East opened doors to highest level strategic planning for resources. And the implications for Australia's agricultural labour force, of course, were staggering from these recommendations. Even though that manpower implications weren't able to be acted on really, it was the case that Australia's food production made some very rapid increases. It was the success story in this period, 1952, 53 and even into 54. My final theme of government powers, though, is where I want to wind up in my final remarks. As was evident 10 years earlier, the problem of ensuring that Commonwealth government prevailed in the generation and allocation of essential resources was hardly a new one. Since the creation of the Loan Council in 1927, the trend towards Commonwealth government exercising greater power in the financial management of economic activity across Australia was clear, but not without constant jostling by the states, and not with the emergence of a strong sense of national will on the management of resources. Depression and then the Second World War accelerated the accumulation of power by the federal government, including direct control over the Commonwealth Bank. And then, of course, in the mid-40s, the Chifley government relied on defence powers in embarking on the Snowy Mountains. So Menzies was very conscious of the problems in readying Australia for war and huge development efforts while the state of war did not exist. In justifying the commitment of forces for South Korea, he glossed over the formal war declaration by emphasising the request from the UN. The High Court's decision in April 1950 to reject the constitutionality of his Communist Party dissolution bill confirmed the struggle he faced. 6 of the 7 High Court judges finding that the bill invaded rights normally assumed by the states and only available to the Commonwealth in times of war. His attempt to amend the Constitution by referendum soon afterwards failed narrowly. He spent a lot of time making the case publicly for a definition of the Cold War that was, to all intents, akin to the previous 2 world wars. I'll quote him in saying, "It was a war in which Australian lives were being lost and also a state of imminent danger of what people might call a hot war." Among the best known of his public efforts are his 3 radio broadcasts in September 1950, collectively called A Defence Call to a Nation. Outlawing the Communist Party of Australia was certainly a focal point for much of his work in elevating the status of the Cold War among Australians, but the point I'm making is it was not his only purpose. As others have described in detail, Menzies continued his pursuit of the Australian Communist Party, also with the help of ASIO, other perceived enemies such as enemy aliens and militant unionists. But he directed considerable attention towards state premiers. His declaration that Australia must prepare for war in 3 years' time was timed as the backdrop to a meeting with state premiers held on the 2nd of March 1951. Power generation was the main topic of conversation, and a Commonwealth State Committee created to oversee efforts to boost power and spur growth in other defence-related fields of production. Power fared actually much less well than efforts to expand food thereafter. So insistent were the states that civil consumption targets needed to be met first, that by the end of 1954, the new committee found little likelihood of Australia being able to reach any time soon the 1939 figure of having 40% power available for defence. Perhaps most symptomatic of the limitations in rapidly expanding the defence and productive capacities of the Australian state, while maintaining government and circumventing the interests of state premiers, was the fate of the Defence Preparations Act, enacted in July 51. It was designed to address this tricky situation of cold but not constitutionally endorsed war. It also took inspiration from a US model, the US Defence Production Act of 1950, enabling the American president to maintain control over wages and prices and to resolve industrial disputes with special measures in order to maintain defence production. Menzies spoke to the Australian version in ways that were similarly capacious in reach, but in practice the legislation was only used by the government to assume central control over capital issues, and it lapsed after 18 months. So how effective, that's the defence, there's some provisions there which outline the kind of framing that Menzies was wanting to do. So how effective was the NSRB and related government efforts in resolving for Menzies the great tensions between war preparations and national development, and between the need for greater government controls and his party's platform of ending regulations and maximising opportunities for free enterprise? Short answer, I think, is not very successful, but nor was it a complete failure. Defence spending was big. As a percentage of GDP, it rose from 2.9% in 1949-50 to 5.1% in 52-53. But around 70% of that increase was soaked up in maintenance rather than expansion. Such had things run down. The stockpiling of crucial materials was also partially successful. Talking about things such as tin, copper, manganese and so on. In many ways, Menzies stretched Australia's economy to the limits in his efforts to craft national security in ways that responded to both immediate threats and longer-term efforts. An assessment by Ronald Mendelsohn, the second director of the NSRB, replacing Ronald Walker, in 1957 is instructive, I think, especially as it considers war preparations of the early 1950s against the backdrop of what had happened in the Second World War, and the work in particular of the War Commitments Committee that operated then. Mendelsohn described the NSRB as the most ambitious effort yet made in peacetime to budget resources and balance need against need. The NSRB filled an identified gap, the need to prepare for imminent war in a state of peace, very clearly. The Prime Minister's role as chair of the board and main recipient of its advice was unusual, to the point of compromising, thought Mendelsohn. But, on the other hand, it was also a constant reminder of the status it enjoyed. But while including leading members of industry and representatives of key government departments, it also stopped short of including Treasury and the Commonwealth Bank, which were two big omissions. Perhaps, mused Mendelsohn, this reflected the limits of a government committed to fewer controls and greater economic freedoms. More tellingly, though, the board was hampered by the conditions of peace and the constitutional restrictions that flowed from not being at war. However felicitous were Menzies' many expressions of how to reconcile the irreconcilable, he asked for order without orders, and many such phrases. In practice, the NSRB lacked powers of compulsion and therefore struggled to overcome the internal voices of protest of armed services, industry and states. It was subordinate to Cabinet, but never really worked out its relationship with Cabinet. The result was that ministers not privy to NSRB discussions could easily react badly to a Prime Minister turning up informed by discussions there and then presenting them to Cabinet. It was a recipe for brooding resentments and calculated delays managed by ministers and their heads of department. The board struggled to establish new priorities in an economy already strained by the demands of ongoing post-war reconstruction and an ambitious immigration program. It was probably an unhelpful coincidence that inflation reached a peak during the board's most active period of 1951-52. Perhaps if the Defence Preparations Act had proved less unpopular and gained more support among a broader range of key industries and government departments, the work of the NSRB might have been a bit more easy. The NSRB couldn't produce a manpower and materials budget which had been at the top of Menzies' wish list. It did, however, produce good assessments of equipment needs for the armed services and stockpiling needs for strategic materials. Possibly its most successful deep dive was in agricultural production, where the food for war preparations and food for expanded Australian exports was a lovely blurred mandate that many could agree on. States were happy to draw on Commonwealth funding, tax incentives and new scientific breakthroughs, including myxomatosis, to assist and sometimes prod farmers into more ambitious activities. It was different when they were asked to venture their priorities for major public works in the name of development. In this exercise, all they came up with was shopping lists rather than priorities shaped by an anticipation of war. And they then reacted indignantly when prioritisation was attempted by the NSRB. As Mendelsohn concluded, quoting my final slide, as he concluded, this was the central issue. The production of an Australian plan for continental development, in this case devoted to the limited object of the most urgent defence preparations. But considerations of sovereignty and perhaps even parish politics prevented any worthwhile conclusion. The NSRB was not able to do what the Loan Council had never really attempted either, even as it had ensured the flow of financial powers away from the states to Canberra. So what does all this mean then, in the context of the Menzies government in the Cold War more generally? I think a few things. First, the early 1950s are a reminder of the extent to which the Menzies government regarded the Cold War as a world war, no matter whether hostilities prompted action, including Australian involvement, in places such as Korea and Malaya. And this was a way of thinking not easily disturbed. In other words, Menzies government struggled to establish compartmentalised priorities around the world. Secondly, war preparations and national development went hand in hand in the eyes of Australia's leaders, partly on account of the recent role that Australia had played as a gigantic base and supplier of food in the Second World War, which was surely one of its most important roles And finally, Australia's history of preparing for war or significant defence measures more generally up to the 1950s featured both nation-forging opportunities but also the risk of the nation splintering. The messy, unfinished business of Australian federalism weighed heavily on the mind of Menzies, the constitutional lawyer turned Prime Minister, who sailed close to the winds of constitutional propriety, his party's platform and the electoral mood, before shelving his most expansive version of an Australian national security state, readying the country for a Cold War that could turn hot. So the capacious kind of national security preparations that Laverack had argued for in the 1930s, from an intelligence perspective, found their way into legislation shaping Australia's efforts in the Second World War. Under the Menzies governments of the early 1950s, both legislative efforts and organisational planning struggled to fulfil the ongoing task of galvanising a relatively new federation to the urgent tasks of defence and development. But it wasn't for lack of trying. Thanks.
David, those of us in the room who wear neckties are particularly pleased that fashion times have moved on that last slide. What a courageous effort that was. David, we will have questions a little later on. Thank you greatly for setting the scene for us as we revisit the world of Menzies and the world as it was at that time. So on our behalf, thank you very much for your presentation today.